In this video, we're going to discuss the Genesis G70 rear-wheel drive and all-wheel drive variant. Now, I've already done a video on the G70 pre-refresh in Canada with the straight pipes, and a lot of this is almost identical. But when I first saw the outside of this, I'm like, this has to be an all-new car. I don't remember seeing a mid-cycle refresh that has this many changes to it. And what it does is it brings this car in an alignment with what they're trying to do in terms of looks. Like, it looks clearly more like the G80, the GV70, and the GV80. That's the Genesis new style. And that's what this has, and it looks quite different for once than some of the German counterparts and the Japanese counterparts. But on the inside space, it is almost identical to the previous car. And the strong things are here. Just take a look at the door panel. It's going to tell you almost everything you need to know. Good use of materials. Armrest has a ruggedized type leather surface. You have alloy look metals or plasti metals along the whole mid part of the door, and this machined looking plastic around the door handle, and it looks great. They still use hard plastics at the top and bottom of the doors, but you know, it just looks and feels very high quality. The rest of the cabin gives you this sports sedan feel without overdoing it. It's still a luxury sedan, or trying to be a luxury sedan, so you don't have a lot of the compromises. You still have the door pockets that are usable, that has usable cup holders. There's a place to put your phone. Everything is almost all physical controls in here. And it's one of the pros and cons of this interior space is it still reeks of the last generation Hyundai products before they switched over to kind of being that luxury brand. So that may bother you, but for me, I think as products have aged, I really like the fact that I can just do everything here in the center stack with physical controls without using the infotainment. Now, the two changes here is they went to this hybrid analog/digital gauge cluster, and I feel like it's kind of cheesy because half of it looks kind of nice with a bezel and the other half is just a generic, digital screen. The infotainment has been updated. They're always updating this. So they got rid of the cheesy children's toy looking infotainment screen with the huge bezels and went to a wide aspect ratio. It flows much better with the interior, and the usability of the screen, again, with the latest generation software, is very nice. The last thing to talk about is the audio system. And I feel like with the Lexicon, and you set it in the reference mode and flatten everything out and turn off the noise reduction for Bluetooth, it is a very neutral sounding car. The bass isn't particularly boomy. The highs aren't overbearing. It's just very neutral and flat, and that's one of the things I like about it. But it lacks some type of definition. It lacks a little bit of brightness, and the soundstage isn't as accurate as I would like. But again, this is not a fatiguing system. Either Bluetooth's great, and of course, if you do Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, you're really going to enjoy listening to music in this car. But let's head into the shop and talk about some of the mechanical changes, which isn't much. Underneath the G70, you're going to have a look at the all-wheel drive and rear-wheel drive version, and it looks almost identical. The only difference you're going to see really is the front half shafts on the all-wheel drive version and the center differential towards the middle part of it. Now, this is really a carryover from the car that I did in Canada, so I'm not going to really cover every single detail. Watch that video, but I'm going to hit you with the highlights. This is a modified version of the G80 long wheelbase sedan with a lot of cost cutting. They've lobbed off the front half of this car and modified the rear. The reason they modified the front is for packaging, to make it a little bit more compact. They didn't have to put a V8 in here, which they're not doing anymore anyway. And they switched it to strut front with a split ball joint in the bottom, and this looks very reminiscent to what BMW does on their strut suspensions, including the knuckle design. This does not have an aluminum sub-frame carrier in the front. There's not as much aluminum in the back like the G80, and you see that split in cost. They're trying to design this for the price point that this is at, for that, how do I say this, sporty sedan, mid-size sedan, and that's what you see here. Now, the difference between the Germans and some of the other brands is Hyundai continues to develop their own all-wheel drive setup and design their own transmission unit. So that's kind of more like what Acura is doing, but you have an 8-speed automatic on both cars. It has been retuned here and modified. They've added things like a Sport Plus mode, but the torque distribution on the all-wheel drive version is very similar. It's not common for them to do it. It still gives you that safe feeling, and if you want that rear-wheel drive, pure rear-wheel drive experience, at least in America, you can get that rear-wheel drive version. It also shaves some weight. You don't have the half shafts in the front, the center differential part of it. But really, everything here is covered up. It's great for NVH. There are huge isolation dampers on the front struts. And you know they're trying to find that balance between a little bit of fun to drive and, of course, the balance of what you expect from a luxury car. The engine is carryover, the 3.3 liter turbo. They save the 3.5 twin turbo for now the upper end of the product lineup, but this doesn't get that. And you still get the 2 liter 4-popper option, which is shared across Hyundai and Kia's lineup. Now, this architecture is still shared with the Kia Stinger, but again, they're constantly making improvements every model year with certain things that they're trying to fix. But let's head out on the road. First, we're going to drive the rear-wheel drive car, then the all-wheel drive. Jack, I've never been in a G70 rear-wheel drive model, and it's not available anywhere, or not everywhere, not every region. And this is the refreshed one, but largely it feels very similar.
It has the Torsen and it has the Brembos as well. And this is the single turbo 3.3 liter.
And they have given you Sport Plus, and now there is an active exhaust. So let's see what it sounds like getting off the line. Oh, launch control. This thing moves, dude. Holy Christ. The brakes are the biggest downfall of this car before we get into it. And you'll notice right away, compared to the all-wheel drive variant, this thing is far more lively. It wants to rotate through turns instead of kind of plow. It feels like it's rear-wheel drive because it is.
And unlike an IS500 Mark, it doesn't always want to go sideways for almost no reason. It feels very, very natural.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing that I like it. And I know you like these M-car like sideways cars, and I like this, the way that this is set up, because it's sideways, but it's not just ridiculous for the sake of it. Like if I want it to go sideways, it doesn't go step all the way out. It basically corrects itself, so it's a lot more natural feeling to me. And the steering is not so fast that the car is just like you turn a little bit and it gets twitchy. It's very controllable, very neutral. It reminds me of the old BMWs, if anything. But I will say there is one problem dynamically, and that is the front and the rear end don't feel particularly connected to each other. And you'll notice it more as it starts to snap back. The front feels very disconnected from the rear of it, so dynamically that's my big complaint. But the big pros here is this is very, very fast. If you're getting into something like this for the first time, the drivetrain, and I've seen the evolution of all the Genesis drivetrains from their 8-speed, this to me is like the best thing they've ever done. It shifts quickly. Granted, there's not true manual control. There's not a real manual mode. You have to pull the paddle, but it will go back into automatic mode. It always goes back into drive from a stop, so you have to go back down into first gear manually. It's annoying, but the shifts are faster than they used to be. The downshifts are more closely connected to like what you're getting in the ZF, and it's an amazingly comfortable car without being too edgy. You can turn off fake engine noise, so all you hear is just the natural engine tone and the turbo whooshing sound. It's a good sport coupe.
Yeah, I mean, as a family sedan or like a dedicated driver's sedan, or what do you want to call a sports sedan, this is very, very competent. And it is almost every bit as good as its German counterparts. And that's the pro or the con of this car. It is so close to all of its competitors, but it's still a Genesis. So it's dealing with brand stigma, and from a closeness perspective, it's also now the same price, more or less, as the Germans is competing against. This competes against, in its rear-wheel drive form, against the M340i, the IS500, which we'll talk about here in a second, the C43 AMG, about pretty much everything else on the planet at this point. And when you get an all-wheel drive, which we'll talk about later, it's even worse. It competes against so many vehicles.
Right, you're opening the door to basically the sky's the limit, and that's where this becomes far less attractive in terms of like
this
what
is
you're
a $55,000 car.
It's not that it's not chump change. So, you know, let's talk about this really quick. The biggest deficiency before you get into the other cars is, my problem is the chassis disconnectedness and the brake pad choice in here is really weak. The brakes fade faster on here than pretty much any other car in the competition. Part of it is weight. This is a heavy-ass vehicle, and the fact that you can reach those triple-digit speeds in next to no time. The brakes give up really quick, and that's one thing I'd have to be cautious about. But if you were going to choose a rear-wheel drive luxury sports sedan, what would that be?
So the IS500 is $62,000, which is more money than this. But
that's the premium package.
The premium package, but you know, equivalently equipped. Right, you're 62 grand versus this at 55. To be honest, the IS500 is unlikely to depreciate, and over a 6-year period, $6,000 or $7,000 is probably not a big deal, to be entirely honest. And the residual will be a lot higher. But the gearbox is archaic, and if you want the newest technology, that's not the car you want to buy. The M340i is more or less the same price as this, maybe like $5 grand more. That's a car that dynamically is better.
Gonna blow this thing. It's gonna blow away all of them.
Yeah.
Essentially, it's gonna blow away all of them.
But it's a lease car. It's not a car that you're gonna keep for a particularly long time. Then you have the C43, which is the most amount of money, and it's very similar to the BMW. It's another car that you're keeping for 3 to 5 years, or if that. It's a lease period vehicle. So that's where this car comes in, right? It is a vehicle, because of its long-term warranty, you could theoretically keep it longer than the German vehicles, but you're losing out on some of the charm of something like the Lexus or the technical proficiency of the German cars.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with you. And I think now is a good time to get into the all-wheel drive car, Jack, and we're going to open up the door to talk about dynamically how that car is different, which we've already driven it, but we're going to talk about how it's different and then all of the competitors that this is going up against.
All right.
All-wheel drive, Jack. And much like the rear-wheel drive version, one of my biggest complaints is the brakes feel weak.
Yeah, this doesn't even have the Brembos or any of the performance bits. This is kind of the bread and butter all-wheel drive V6 variant. So you don't have the mechanical diffs, you don't have the Brembos, but what you do still have is the V6, which still means this is a very, very fast car, and because it's all-wheel drive, it feels a little bit more safe.
So really, yeah, and you make a great point, because most people are not going to even consider the rear-wheel drive version. We're lucky we have it because it is better to drive, I'll be honest. But if you're living in adverse climates, this
or markets that don't even get the rear-wheel drive,
this is what you're getting, and this is the most mainstream product. You can use it year-round, and if you put winter tires on this thing, it's going to tear it up.
Yeah.
Dynamically, it's different in the fact that it feels far more front-wheel drive-ish. When you turn in, it kind of has that front-end pull or push first, and before it transfers power to the back. And that's one thing dynamically I don't like. It doesn't feel as all-wheel drive as the Audi equivalents and BMW all-wheel drive equivalents. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just you can't have any fun with it like you can the rear-wheel drive version.
But let's be honest, right? If you're buying a sports sedan and you are, the John businesses of the world that'll be buying or leasing this thing, who gives a shit, right? Dynamically, what people care about is it comfortable, is it quiet, and can I pass the poor people around me on the highway? And you can do that in an all-wheel drive 3.3 G70. It's very good in that regard.
This car is fast.
Yes, it's very fast.
It's a little slower feeling, and I think it's some of the drivetrain loss from the rear-wheel drive version. It's not as zesty to get going. It's not as eager to get going, and the transmission programming to me is just a little bit different, and it could be subtle to me, but compared to the last G70 I drove in Canada, what they've done here, they've revised the tuning for the gearbox again. It is so much better than the previous generation.
It's not a
car.
night and day difference between the rear-wheel drive and the all-wheel drive when it comes to the drivetrain. I do think that there are two separate buyers for this vehicle, right? If you're buying the all-wheel drive variant, honestly, you probably don't even need the performance variant or the adaptive dampers. This has passive dampers on this car, and it's totally good enough for most
It's a
people.
really quiet, comfortable, a car you're not going to get tired of, other than it being a little bit boring. But as you said, the person that's looking for this wants the checkpoint or the checkbox type stuff. Is it quiet? Is it comfortable? Is there a level of quality to it? Can I tear it up in a straight line? And the answer is yes. It's a very, very good car. Is it worth upgrading from the last G70? And the straight answer is no. They're very, very similar, other than the trans tuning and the exterior design, which was a pretty massive makeover.
It's a good looking car.
Yeah, it's really essentially very, very similar to the last G70, so you shouldn't feel bad if you're a previous gen owner here. I wish them the best in this car, and I hope they continually improve it, and you can definitely see the evolution of this car from when I first drove them when they came out. It's a much better product, it's a much more competitive product, but it's the same broken record. Who's going to be considering this over the German competition?
And as a non-enthusiast purchase, if you want that generic fast luxury sedan, and at its price of low 50s to mid 50s, or even high 40s to mid 50s, this is in a very, very tough field. TLX Type S, which you can argue may look better. You have the Acura branding, you have the Acura dealer experience. Audi S4 matches this thing dollar for dollar in prices and trim levels. That is a very, very competent car. Faster, better all-wheel drive system. A ZF gearbox. And then, of course, you have the all-wheel drive variants of the cars we just spoke about. The M340i and the AMG C43 or whatever it's called. You have all of these German competitors. You have all of these Japanese competitors. The only car that it's a clear victor over is the Lexus IS350 all-wheel drive. But,
yeah.
I mean, that car is 1 million years old. You have to really want to experience a new brand and maybe value some of the potential added benefits of Genesis, like a theoretical lower running cost in maintenance, not depreciation, and a longer warranty. But past that, you have to love the styling, you have to love the interior, but just objectively, it's hard for me to say it's better than the other cars.
Let's get into the final thoughts and talk about the pros and cons of this car. Final thoughts on the G70. Now, clearly, I prefer the rear-wheel drive variant. I feel like it is far more dynamic and engaging to drive. But the reality, like Jack said, most people are going to get the all-wheel drive version because it's far more usable year-round. But at least you have that option, at least in the United States. Now, the big question is, I feel like they are trying to pull customers away from Audi and BMW and the German brands, but they still kind of stand alone like Acura and Lexus are. If you're going to cross-shop this car, you're probably looking at the IS350 and the TLX. And in both cases, the G70 is a far more compelling package, at least in the here and now. For a 3-year lease, the technology works better, the lane keep assist and the safety systems are more coherent, it's less annoying, it doesn't tug on the wheel as much, it stays in its lane, it doesn't bounce. All the technology stuff, including the infotainment, is great. The interior might be a little bit dated, not as forward as the Acura, but this is a true rear-wheel drive architecture, something that the Acura can't compete with. Now, in terms of performance and straight line speed, this thing hauls ass. The 3.3 liter turbo is going to blow you away, and with the updates to the transmission tuning, it's far less clunky. It blows away the 8-speed and the IS. It is way better than the TLX Type S. It feels far less neutered. You have more control of it. It gear hunts less, and it lets you utilize the entire power band of this engine. This is far more competitive with the Germans in terms of performance. The ride refinement finds a balance between all of them. You're really splitting hairs here. If you want the softest ride, you got to go to the Lexus. It's more on par with kind of the Audi ride. But again, I'm comparing all these because there's so many different options here. This, as it stands, is a great alternative to that luxury moniker while bringing you a lot of what everybody else does. I'd say take a look at it, but this is not something I'd want to make a long-term commitment to at this point with the refresh, and there's going to be yet probably another one that's all new in the next couple of years. But thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.